Hello and welcome to the Dublin Conversations. Susan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Dr. Susan Kinear, and I am at the University of Dundee, where I have a senior management role, but my background and my teaching focus is in communications and public relations.
Thank you for joining us. And we're doing what we call the 5 steps to the Dublin window, where we're looking at perhaps a new model, a different model of looking at the world for anyone in the communications industry. And as I say, we begin out with our sort of 5 steps. And we began with really an analogy that many people working in the communications industries, a bit like the early astronomers, where they had the Earth at the center of their universe. And what we're suggesting really at the center of a bigger picture going ahead is this idea of confidence. And we define confidence as a confidence as a reliable expectation of subsequent reality. So in our work, we're in the business of creating the confidence others have in us, that we won't hurt them or harm them, others have in us that we can help them, and we have generally with other people around us. And so that our understanding of reality is actually based on perceptions. So at the center of this universe is how we create confidence to manage perceptions around future behaviors, and that having an authentic purpose makes this task easier because it enables you to be more coherent and potentially more compelling in order to effectively socially interact. So we've got a bigger picture there of social interactions where creating confidence is a critical agency to enable people to live together, work together, to collaborate together. So I just wondering, any thoughts about that, Susan?
Yeah, let's unpick that a little bit. Now, obviously, I'm an academic, so I'm going to be thinking about this from an academic perspective. And from our conversations so far, there's automatically some elements that we might look at in terms of creating confidence, but also you talked about meeting people's needs. So we might think about that from an academic perspective of Maslow, for example.
Yeah.
So and also from a boundary spanning perspective, if we thought about systems theory. So when you are talking about this from a solar perspective, and you're saying that you want to put confidence in the center of your map of the world, I guess, your map of the galaxy, you've described what you mean by confidence, but whose confidence? Whose confidence is at the center of all of this? Is it your stakeholders' confidence in the organization? Is it your internal confidence in your purpose? So whose confidence do we mean when we are considering that?
I think that's a great observation, and one of the critical tasks we see the Dublin Conversations working on is a very exploration of those points you raise, of the unpicking of confidence. And if you look at most PR communication textbooks, the word confidence doesn't even barely appear in index references, let alone as a key part. And certainly in response to the points you make there, it exists in a number of different dimensions within oneself. So your own confidence in your own perception of reality, confidence with others that they have in you, confidence they have in each other, and communally confidence. And then maybe also a further dimension of perhaps a zeitgeist confidence. So for example, business confidence can drive the financial markets. Political confidence can drive a sense of peace or security, or war and insecurity. And so really, I think what you've highlighted there is a real need to unpick, clarify, and get great. So perhaps we would regard it as our known unknowns in terms of more to be learned and more to be discovered about us, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. One of the other things you've just mentioned there is that you don't see confidence appearing in textbooks. So the way that we teach, and obviously you'll know this yourself from the teaching that you do too, quite a lot of the teaching around comms at the moment is focused on measurement and KPIs. So one of the things that we might want to be thinking, if we were putting confidence and or confidence in our authenticity, confidence in our purpose at the center of our universe, is how do we measure when we've achieved that? And again, if we look at comms and public relations practice at the moment, again, a lot of that is focused on how we demonstrate our value, we demonstrate our worth. So if we're thinking about how we create confidence, one of the things that we ought to be considering as well is how we measure or how we demonstrate what we've achieved and the value of what we've achieved in terms of confidence itself. So maybe one way of thinking about this is from a stakeholder perspective. So if our internal stakeholders' confidence in our authenticity and our external stakeholders' confidence in our authenticity, and how that authenticity is linked to our overall purpose itself.
And I think it's what you raised there, Susan, is the idea of maybe this, like we're looking there, an image of a sort of two-dimensional image, but a three-dimensional image with many different layers, perhaps say of individual level, stakeholder level, and zeitgeist level, possibly. Also, then I think what I might suggest is if we look through the other subsequent steps, I think that's a brilliant bridge because hopefully this will provide a degree of unpicking where each element could itself then provide a sub-framework, a range of measures that could maybe then use to globally collect together to address that central question there. So if you're happy with this, we'll look at the next step, which would be about how do we go about socially interacting? And this is a delightful model created by a friend of mine, the Professor Gareth Loudon of Imperial College London, where it's a simple process of what he calls listen, connect, do. So we listen and listen in its broadest sense with every sense. We connect what we listen to with other things around us, and that could be conceptually and practically. And then that is do, that could develop development of a concept or a tangible action. And it's this a Mobian strip of constant listen, connect, do, listen, connect, do, where at the beating heart of it is this idea of purpose, that purpose, if you have a stronger sense of purpose, that potentially could then drive your listening, connect, doing on a greater, bigger scale mission. So the idea then is that we listen, connect, do, and that through the work of sociologists, we can identify that there's almost now like universal laws of human behavior, where, for example, 2 out of 3 people will help a stranger, which also means that 1 out of 3 don't. So there's possibly there like the instincts of a we-led approach, where your instinct is to think of the common good, the communal good, other people first, and then me-led, which is one way is thinking of self-interest, self-concerns first. And it could well be then that these could potentially be the foundation stones for a philosophical approach, where in an age of integrated communications, is there any difference between a PR or advertising approach using those previous traditional labels? And potentially there could be an evolution here where public relations may emerge as a philosophy based on a we-led approach in an integrated communications world. So I just wonder, any thoughts there about this idea of the importance of listening, and secondly, the sort of instincts at work, and sort of this idea here.
Well, I did have 2 ideas where you're talking, but I've forgotten them now. I have to come back.
You're over listening.
I was over listening. So I think we probably need to take this back to an organizational perspective, because the way that I've used your frameworks in the past has been perhaps less philosophical and more pragmatic. So how do we use your frameworks to ask or to develop questions to help us better understand practice itself? So I'm possibly less concerned with the philosophical elements of it and more concerned with the pragmatic elements of it. So again, if we come back to purpose, because the whole part of our conversation really is about how this affects purpose and how purpose then affects communications, is around making this an iterative process. So listen, connect, do isn't something that you do once, it's something that you do over and over and over again. And I guess the other thing is using this as a process to affect dynamism or to become more dynamic as an organization. So to become a listening organization, you don't set your purpose in stone once and never deviate from it, and nor should you have an expectation that is what you're going to do. But that does leave you in a bit of a quandary, because if you're trying to communicate authenticity as a core characteristic, how do you become both dynamic and authentic at the same time? So how do you decide what your vision and your values are going to be if you're going to be consistently sort of developing those? And I guess that comes down to consistently listening to stakeholders. So if you have identified a very distinct group of stakeholders that you wish to work with, and that you think align with your own values, it's quite important that you continuously listen to them and continuously align what you're doing alongside their values. And their values might change, their thoughts might change, their ideas of how those values are applied might change over time. So again, this listening and connecting and doing is very significant in terms of stakeholder engagement. Personally, I am less concerned about the distinctions between advertising and public relations. I think really we are in an environment now where we're talking more about communications overall, and how communications overall sit as part of a framework of stakeholder engagement. So not quite so worried about the philosophy of it, more how do we translate this framework into something meaningful that organizations can use? I think organizations might really struggle to differentiate between a me and a we, because most modern organizations should perceive themselves as being a we anyway. So I guess one of the things that they might want to ask themselves is, if they think they're starting to adopt a me mindset rather than a we mindset, maybe that's a point in time where they need to stop and think to themselves, really, are we engaging with the right stakeholders? Are we creating meaningful relationships, or are we simply projecting? So that does bring me back to the other thing that I had disappeared quickly from my mind while you were talking there, which is about genuine symmetry. So if we are looking to adopt genuinely symmetrical communications, it's almost impossible to do that unless you are engaging in a continuously iterative listen, connect, do, because the things that you do have to be meaningful to the people that you're connecting with and the people that you're listening to. So I don't think you can really become genuinely or authentically symmetrical unless you are continuously involved in that iterative cycle. But as I said, thinking about how organizations might use this, or how they are looking to perhaps make it more practical and more applied for their own organizations. I think they might struggle with the me and the we a bit, possibly because we are in an environment where we have more integrated approach to communications now, and we'd need to think about how they utilized that in a helpful manner or how organizations utilized listen, connect, and do in a manner that was meaningful to them.
Many fascinating insights there. I think you've highlighted there this incredible tension between certainty and uncertainty, and then in managing perceptions of future behaviors, the balance between consistency and change. So I think there's this concept of symmetry is an interesting one, of alignment with authenticity. And as I say, I think what may have also highlighted there is this issue of is there a need? We're creating a bigger picture that goes beyond the previously traditional used terms of public relations and advertising. Is there a need for a new label for this bigger world? Some of, as you say, highlighted word communications, but then is communications sufficient to cover the fact that are we in the business of also behavior change, also building social cohesion, and also being an authentic purpose? So there's is there a need for a bigger label, and B, there's an existing potential candidate in the widely used word of comms, which is seen as a derivative of communications, but we're seeing perhaps as a potential candidate for a label for a far bigger thing than communications, and the need for such a label will give us a way forward. And there's also some fabulous insight there that actually there could be the we-led and me-led is about also developing tools to address that very question of are you we led, how adequate or how sufficient you are we led or me led, and that in itself is a need for some sort of tool to gain insight. So a massive amount you've identified there. Just wondering if any further points about this idea about and we've got a landscape there which needs maybe does it need a new term that replaces or includes within it the previous terms that we use in our industry, such as public relations and advertising?
I think that there is a really significant conversation to have about that. And I think there is a really important conversation that we also need to use or have about the term corporate reputation management. So at CIPR, for example, their definition of public relations is that it is about reputation management. But I think our new and emerging stakeholders perceive reputation management in a very different way to people of our generation, Andy. So I was talking to our students here recently about whether we wanted to launch a new module in reputation management. And the feedback they had from the students was very, very negative. They said that they hadn't come to university to be taught how to lie. And, I think that's a really significant thing. Those who are people or those in decision-making positions in organizations still have an older mindset where we regard reputation as a positive thing. But actually our, new stakeholders are emerging younger groups of people because of the different contexts that they're living under, because of the kind of post-truth society that we're now living within, perceive this in a very different way to the way that we do. And that comes back down to authenticity, comes back down to purpose. So how do we as organizations and how do we as comms professionals engage younger people who view us as professional liars?
I think that's some fascinating research and insight there. And it strikes me there's two dimensions there. One is I say of the students who say we're not come here to lie, and the reason for that being morally wrong, but also if you lie, it then undermines your ability to create confidence in your reliable expectations of subsequent reality. And second, on a corporate level, why do you need a good corporate reputation? So you can build confidence in reliable expectation. So I think there's potentially possibly a way where this thinking here could provide a platform, a space for those different views to reconnect and come up with something new, where critically both generations need to live together, work together to live and survive and ensure we survive in our world. So possibly, I think there's some fabulous insights there and further discussions to be had.
I think so, but it's also evidence of just how much damage has been done. You see, I would have argued that through the pandemic, actually, public relations finally came into its own. People finally understood what public relations was for. Although obviously people working in social marketing would argue that that's what the comms during the pandemic was around social marketing. But I wouldn't argue that. I think that people finally understood, that's what PR's for. It's for, helping communicate when there's a really desperate, significant public need for that. But if we're in a situation now where post the pandemic and post this absolute massive proliferation of misinformation, post-Trump, post-truth, what do our young people actually consider to be real any longer? And when they're looking at organizations and organizational communications, how do we help them identify what's true and what's not true, and how can that possibly be linked to confidence in what an organization has to say about itself? So there are lots of questions to ask. So I'm kind of like a year on or a year into the pandemic, I was like, oh, fantastic, people have finally got what PR is actually for. And now 3 years on, it's more actually people's entire confidence in public communication itself has been really, really rocked by the past. So we do need to come back to these central questions of what is authenticity, what is purpose, and what is the purpose of organizational communication. It's not organizational hiding, it's organizational transparency.
But there's also a bigger question there, because when you say people seemingly last recognise what public relations was about, Was it also an implicit appreciation that not only just about communications, but it's about behaviour change and also building social cohesion,
Yeah.
and that going forward, as I say, there's a need for a sort of a new hymn sheet, a new common ground to come together, because, as you say, there's a increasing division, and old models are increasingly seen as tainted, even toxic. And do we need, as I say, to create a new canvas together? Or we're suggesting the analogy of a window to see it like a bigger picture than what just immediately before us. So some fascinating insights there, Susan.
Yeah,
I just
brings us on to goals, doesn't it? What was
Indeed,
the
yeah.
goal
So,
of the
yeah,
organisation?
yeah. So, as I say, step three, just to elaborate there. So, this is inspired by the work of people like Professor Daniel Kahneman, who identified that people are emotionally driven animals, and that the challenge was, well, how do you then connect with an emotionally driven animal? And I think really referring back to your early point, we not only got to look at purpose as a core concept for individual stakeholders to act as their nucleus, their foundation stones but it's then also the mechanics of how we socially interact.
Yeah,
And
just
here,
I'll just stop you there. Just to clarify again before. So whose purpose when we mean? Are we talking about organizational purpose, or are we talking about individuals' purpose? So when
well, yes,
whose purpose do we mean?
yeah. Well, a suggestion in the slide one is purpose in your perception of reality. So we're now recognizing that what we understand as reality is a perception. You have a perception in your own personal purpose. There's perceptions you have in others and others have in you. Perceptions others have in each other. And as I say, this Zeitgeist conference, and I'll certainly concur and agree with you that there's a need for further elaboration, potentially greater precision in this sort of map that potentially we're creating here. And certainly that I think what you've realised there is it exists in multiple dimensions, rather than just one like linear path and one linear dimension.
So what you from my perspective, from a PR perspective, is where this sits for me, or the value of this for me, is perhaps in identifying, translating, and communicating organizational purpose. Now, if we're meaning at the same time that we can use confidence in purpose to identify stakeholders who may have a well-aligned individual purpose that sits alongside ours, then great, it becomes much clearer. But I think we need to be clear about, again, whose purpose we mean, how we are identifying and defining what that purpose is, and how we are measuring confidence in that purpose. So whose confidence in whose purpose to do what?
I'm just wondering, and forgive me, maybe it's something I could have maybe established at the outset. You mentioned there about looking at this from a PR perspective. Is there a need to actually look at like the window of the world we look at, and without the lenses of whether it's public relations, communications, or advertising and so on, and saying, right, okay, looking at this window of the world, how does it work? How does it operate? And therefore, from that, how can I then reinterpret and revisit my previous concepts of things like public relations, communication, advertising? Do they have any relevance in this bigger window, or do they need repurposing, reframing with maybe like the insights from this bigger window? So I just wonder whether there's a possible challenge there about recognizing that in responding to this new model, there's perhaps a need to sort of maybe have a neutral blank canvas approach. By all means, then subsequently at the end of the sort of journey, pose that question, and from a PR perspective, how does this thing hold together? I just wonder maybe if I can elaborate a bit more about the 5 goals and so on, and that we can then maybe revisit that at the end.
Well, yeah, just to say, I don't think we need to differentiate between whether it's an advertising purpose or a PR purpose. Yeah. It's an organizational purpose. So I guess that's the mindset I'm approaching this. So if we move on to goals, this comes back to what are the organizational goals, and how do the organizational goals link to the organizational purpose, and how do you maintain dynamism within that purpose and those goals through listen, connect, and do. So I guess that's, for me, that's how those three elements are connected together.
I think you've raised an intriguing point there, and that is there a need, actually, when we look at this world of, like, what does it consist of and how do we understand it, that actually we should work from the building block of individuals rather than organizations, and that then when we come to study about organizations, maybe consider it from the lens of an organization being an accumulation of individuals, rather than, as I say, as a collective thing that exists in its own right, regardless of individual input. So I just wonder, there's an interesting.
But how would you do that? So is the purpose of the canvas to get individuals to think about organizations that they want to work for or organizations that they want to join, or is the purpose, which is how I've used it in the past, or is the purpose of the canvas to get organizations to think about how they need to connect with different stakeholder groups and how they need to develop and create authenticity?
It works on all those different levels, from the experience of our pilot projects. So, for example, when we've developed a purpose program with 7 steps, and the first step in that is identifying your values. One perhaps insight might be that the typical process is to look at the collective. What's the collective values? Rather than maybe look at the individual values of the leadership team, the collective values accumulated through those individual values of the leadership team, then look at the organizational values, rather than as the organizational values as an independent entity from the individuals who are the key people in driving it. So I think there's an interesting area to explore there in terms of clarification about, well, how does this entity consist of? Is it an accumulation of individuals, or is it an entity in its own right that needs to be only explored in its own right? So I think there's certainly a debate.
Yeah, I think that'll be different for different organizations as well. So depending on the structure and hierarchy and organizational culture of any entity will have an impact on that. The other thing as well is identifying whether you're allowing individual values to predominate, or if there are collective values that predominates, can help in terms of establishing authenticity. So if you really want to be a unified, authentic organization, the stakeholders within that organization do need to have a coherent and unified approach to values. So one of the issues that you've got is where you've got an organization that proposes or projects that it has one set of values, and then you have individuals within that organization whose values don't align. And that's where you do get an inauthenticity. That's where you do get sort of issues in terms of poor behavior, and where you get stakeholders who very quickly become frustrated with that organization in terms of lack of authenticity, and where there's no alignment between what they're saying, what they believe, and what they value, and what they actually do. So again, coming back to goals, it's really important that those values are defined. It's really important that those are clearly and consistently communicated. And I think you're right. This framework can work on a multidimensional level, but if you are looking from a kind of how do you use it as a strategic tool, it can help you, or as the way that I've used it in the past is helping you to identify what it is about your purpose that would align with your stakeholders, would help you in terms of differentiation, would help you in terms of being attractive to different stakeholder groups. But again, coming back to the fact that you need to link those to KPIs, you need to link them to what it is that you can project, what is it you can measure, what is that you can actually show something tangible within.
I think what you've highlighted there is the significant difference between a top-down approach, where a group of people come together and their collective values are seemingly identified and then imposed down, or possibly what we may have sort of stumbled upon here is an emergent bottom-up approach, where by working with the constituent parts of a community, team, organization, and then what emerges from those individual components in a collective sense And so that's very much, say, bottom-up driven, emergent driven, may be a vehicle and a route for greater authenticity. So I think that's some interesting points to raise there. If I can just maybe elaborate a bit about the detail here, and that again might illuminate. So as I say, step 3 about identifying the goals. This is inspired, as I say, by the work of Professor Daniel Kahneman, who identified that another behavioral psychologist who identified that we're emotionally driven animals, but also that within that identify what we've labeled like 5 key goals, or the heuristics, rules of thumb, that shapes successful social interaction. And so by identifying sort of 5 key goals of being known, liked, trusted, front of mind, or being talked about, these 5 goals, if you're successful in managing those dimensions of perceptions, it enables you to successfully socially interact with others, to at the very least live together, to successful interactions, potential collaborations. And certainly, as I say, like we've also then got potential with these 5 components to provide a granularity of potential measures. So potential see this as very much a framework for any dashboard, and a framework of tangible measures that you can then identify these elements to give you that sort of the data, a framework for analysis. So, and we believe this actually frames any campaign, that if you look at it, or any your very existence of social interaction. So it works from a level of the fundamentals of your being there and existing, through to campaigns and promotional activity. So I just want
I was just about to say actually that what the 5 elements that you've identified there sound almost exactly like one would break down a series of communications objectives into. So I mean, that step 3 then could be extended out into the series of communications objectives. But this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we are looking almost, I mean, at this point in time, the framework starts to become strategic. So if you think that you're defining or creating confidence in what your aims might actually be when you're looking at listening, connecting and doing it, and effectively you're involved in situational analysis, aren't you? And by the time you get to goals, if you're looking at those 5 frameworks, you're looking at setting your actual objectives. So it can be mapped against a strategic approach to actually planning communications activities.
And certainly that's a good point, in that it operates both at a tactical level, a strategic level, and also suggest by identifying goals in my storytelling workshops, a simple technique for identifying narrative is the introduction of goals. So it works both at a narrative level, strategic level, and tactical level. And you then, let's say, in step 4, where we identify the opens choices. So we're familiar in the communications industry with the what's called the PESO model of paid, earned, shared, and owned. But opens choices goes much further and deeper than that, in terms of providing a sort of a map of how we socially interact with other. So if in order to get known, like, trusted, front of mind, talked about, these give us 5 routes to do so. And own goes beyond just own channels in the traditional model, but your own existence, being there, can be a way of influencing other. Giving time to other people can be a very profound way of earning trust. Your own sort of interaction skills and so on. So own is a much deeper and a concept, and maybe currently seen as like just residing in own channels, and the introduction also there, the new dimension of nudge. So again, it's possible to influence behaviors without communicating. So the example always uses, if you want to eat people for an international audience, I've got to say French fries. You put the French fries at the end of, say, a canteen line, so that by the time people arrive at the French fries, their plate may be already full with other food. So as I say, so you can influence behavior without even communicating there. So we're suggesting then that we've got, a structure here, a framework, which again lends itself to measurement, that you can then measure your capability and performance along each of these parameters there. So you can see there that in order to effectively socially interact the world, you need to listen, connect, do, with 5 goals, where you've got these 5 choices to help guide how you socially interact. And it's not just the 5 independent choices, but obviously then also the synergy within them that then lends itself to integrated comms or communications.
Yeah, okay. But coming back to values and authenticity, so you've spoken a bit about behaviours there. Our esteemed friend Rod Cartwright once explained to me very, very eloquently that organisations are defined not by the values that they claim they have, but by the behaviours that they tolerate. So we have to think not just about the behaviours that we want to promote in our customers, but we also need to think about the behaviours that we manifest within the organisation itself and how PaySo might help that. So how PaySo might help in terms of supporting, consolidating, promoting certain types of behaviours to align with our own values within the organisation. So, again, just coming back to what we were saying earlier on, this can work upon multiple levels with different groups of stakeholders.
I'd certainly agree there that behaviours in terms of building likability and trust and front of mind and so on. Behaviours, listen to what I do rather than what I say, is as I say, the most profound form of social interaction going forward there. And then lastly, we talk about sort of this idea then that not only is there a need for a bigger label to describe a bigger panorama of activity, but also in the nature of it, that it needs not only to be successful in listening, connect, doing, achieving 5 goals and successfully exploiting or using 5 open choices, but it's also then got to add and contribute to the social environment, the social ecosystem within it which operates with. And so we've coined this term like regenerative comms that describes how you add value in your social actions and replenish the social fabric of trust, togetherness, and being able to come together to tackle our critical challenges as a critical dimension for any social interaction. That if you lie, as I say, that diminishes from the collective pot. But if you replenish through virtuous behaviour, virtuous choices, and virtuous support, then there's a way of building the pot that can aid, overcome division and aid greater collective responses to the existential challenges we face there. So I just want any thoughts there about this idea about the need to replenish and this possible idea of regenerative comms.
Well, this comes back, doesn't it, to symmetrical communications and the need to develop a dynamic purpose. So, again, any comms campaign, any comms strategy is that's successful, meaningful, purpose driven is going to need to be symmetrical in nature. So it's going to need to ensure that you engage with, listen, connect, do with your key stakeholder groups. So if you are focusing on that, if you are building KPIs and metrics around key stakeholders, around being genuinely symmetrical, rather than dictatorial or didactic in your approach, then you should end up hopefully with an iterative process that enables you to maintain dynamism anyway. So that in itself should be regenerative in nature. Can't speak now at the end of the day. Regenerative in nature. So it should mean that you're able to keep ahead of or at least aligned with what the right kind of a purpose and values are for your stakeholder groups. I think all of this needs to keep coming down to listening to and engaging with from an organizational perspective with your stakeholders. And I think actually, even if you're looking at this at a personal level, all of us at a personal level have relationships with many different networks, many different individuals. In reality, a lot of stakeholder engagement is an extension of that. It's an extension of our kind of networked interconnectivity, but at an organizational strategic level rather than an individual level. So again, if we are engaging in any of these kind of relationships in a listening capacity rather than a telling capacity, if we are maintaining dynamism, then we should by extension be able to engage in regenerative comms anyway.
And I think, as I say, I think a critical endorsement of the need for such intentions and such sort of modus operandi and living in that we can't just be taking, which might succeed in individual cases and individual levels in creating short-term gains, but ultimately there's going to be a long-term cost, and we're witnessing that in the great social divisions experience in our society. So if I can sort of maybe come to the sort of end of our sort of 5 steps there. So essentially what we're looking to do is create a different window from which we can not see enable people to see a bigger picture. We initially used the metaphors of like a bigger map, but then that imposes that we know the boundaries and we know the dimensions, and so hopefully this provides a tool for enabling people to maybe get out of the existing boxes and silos of looking at the world, and then revisit those and come up with a reframing, repurposeful future. I'm just wondering, sort of before we go, so I mean, you've done a sort of 5 steps there, and we talk about this confidence about a reliable expectation of future. But has this helped in any way sort of address the question of what does better look like in terms of how we, anyone, whether an academic or practitioner in the communications industry, looks to progress and make things better in what we do and our contribution to the wider world?
I think it might help it in terms of giving structure to the questions that we need to ask in order to identify what better looks like. I don't think in itself it's going to help us to identify what better looks like, because that's going to be individual for every organization and every individual. But it is really helpful in terms of identifying the questions that we need to ask. And certainly when I've used the Dublin Conversations purpose framework in the past, it's been really, really instrumental for students in terms of identifying, what their purpose actually is, and helping them as well in terms of those questions to differentiate between different types of purpose, recognizing that their own purposes might be multi-dimensional. So when they're looking maybe at launching their own businesses or engaging in their own commercial activities, but it's a really good framework for identifying the questions that you need to ask. I think it's probably the best way I would articulate that.
I think that's a wonderful point. I fully agree with it. In life, it's better. We may not come up with answers, but if we can come up with better quality questions, we can move forward. So going forward there. So really looking at the Dublin Conversations, is there anything we should be doing different from what you've observed and what you know of what the Dublin Conversations is about?
I think that you could possibly, to make it clearer, you could possibly further unpick or further explain what you perceive to be the relationship between individual and organizational purpose. Because again, from my perspective as an academic, when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking of how students might use it. They may use it to think about what their own individual career purpose might be, but they might really struggle to translate that into what a comms purpose could be for them as they move through their career.
Yeah.
But for me, I think it's helpful if we use a mindset of what's the organizational purpose, and we ask where does the values come from, where does the purpose come from for the stakeholders in order to establish what their organizational purpose is. But I think that for it to work properly, there needs to be real clarity right at the beginning in terms of whose purpose are we talking about here? And then when you've got that, everything else falls into place. But it may be that is different for different people. But I think the canvas itself or the conversations could make that clearer. Because as soon as we start talking about different types of philosophies and different types of emotional responses, they can be quite confusing for people unless they're really clear about how they're applying them from the outset. So I appreciate that you are looking at this for a range of different audiences, but I think maybe the initial bit could help establish how the relevance to those audiences is best articulated.
I think it's really helpful there, and also, I mean, the significance. I like when we talk about authentic purpose. I'm perhaps now going to go away and talk about authentic dynamic purpose, and that as a key learning there going forward. So massive amounts I've learned from these conversations and helped me grow there. Any specific action steps you think we need to take to go forward in terms of looking to kickstart faster change to realize the biggest impact we possibly can?
Well, there's so much there, isn't there? And there are so many models. So one of the things that we could talk about, which I did allude to right at the beginning, but we could investigate in a further conversation, is about how purpose links to motivation. So what you actually spoke about in the introductory sentence, or the introductory section to this, made me think about motivation and models of motivation, and how motivation then links to purpose, and how that links to stakeholder engagement. And we didn't really get a chance to explore that. So that might be something that we can look at. I mean, we've spoken very, very briefly about some classic models within the comms school, such as systems theory, you know, and such as PESO. But there are some wider organizational models that can also help to us to unpick and understand some of these processes better. As I said, if you look at those different 5 stages, they can map against you know, strategic approach to comms quite nicely. But again, symmetrical communication again could be a significant part of that. And that's all fairly obvious. But I guess the bit that I had that initial response to and thought, oh, great, we could maybe investigate that, and then we didn't perhaps get the chance to, is motivation, and how motivation sits alongside that. Because you talked about needs, and you talked also about behavior change and possibly nudge. And I don't think you're really going to sort of nail down any of those within the comms framework unless you're able to sort of talk about or try and introduce concepts about how motivation affects those as outputs. So maybe that's something to look at further developing.
Certainly, I think what I'm visualizing there is almost, say, a third dimension, where at the outset, as you say, in multiple layers, where individual, team, group, community, stakeholders on, and also then that's, for example, within like the lines of the Mobius strip of the listen, connect, do. There's almost like a certain dynamic energy within that could be unpicked, and different ingredients of it could be very useful then.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, what motivates both individuals and organizations to adopt a particular purpose? And if we are going to understand that as being a state of dynamic change, what motivates the change? What motivates the dynamism? So I guess those are just other things to consider.
Well, I'm like a child in a sweet shop with conceptual models. So I think I feel like I'm now a child in a hypermarket with what we've talked about here. So look, massive thanks, Susan. Really appreciate that. And as I say, I've certainly significantly grown, and new thoughts, new ideas, new elaborations going forward there. So massive thanks, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
See you soon. Yeah. Bye, Andy.
Take care. Okay, switch off the recording there.